We did not emerge from the warrens into silence so much as into a different kind of order, one that announced itself not through absence but through alignment, through the subtle reassurance of things placed where they were expected to be and kept there long enough to lose any sense of improvisation. The tunnels beyond were cleaner, not in the way of care or pride, but in the way of use, cleared just enough to allow steady movement without interruption, their walls bearing fewer marks of chance and more of intention, surfaces worn smooth by repetition rather than neglect. And the air, while still heavy, carried less rot and more of the dry, dusty scent of places where people pass through rather than remain. That distinction mattered, and I felt it settle into place as we moved, the way certain truths do, not as revelation but as confirmation. Places where people remain accumulate weight, the residue of lives pressed too closely together, memories clinging to stone and timber alike, while places where people merely pass through accumulate efficiency, shedding anything unnecessary until only function remains. We followed the slope upward slightly, not enough to suggest escape, but enough to tell me we were moving towards something designed to connect rather than contain, and I noticed how the water channels narrowed here, diverted neatly into carved grooves that guided it away from the path instead of letting it pool and stagnate. The absence of debris, as notable as its presence had been elsewhere, no broken tools, no discarded restraints, no signs of improvisation or haste. Someone maintained this, not occasionally, not when things went wrong, but as part of a rhythm that had long since ceased to feel remarkable to those responsible for it. The ranger noticed first, pausing briefly as his eyes traced the curve of the passage ahead, and though he said nothing, the way he angled his body told me he was beginning to think less about terrain and more about traffic, about who moved through this space and how often, and what it meant when movement followed patterns instead of necessity. The mage confirmed it a moment later, gesturing subtly toward a section of wall where faint markings had been scratched and then partially erased. Not symbols meant to be read in isolation, but instructions meant to be remembered, measurements and counts and indications of timing that assumed familiarity rather than explanation. This was no longer the edge of the operation. This was the spine. We reached a small chamber where several tunnels converged, each marked in its own quiet way, not with signs or banners, but with use itself. Rope grooves cut into stone showing which routes bore heavier loads, iron hooks set into the walls at regular intervals, their placement too consistent to be incidental, too practical to be decorative. Crates had once been stacked here, I could tell, though they were gone now, leaving behind only scuffed stone and the ghost of order, the kind that lingers after something has been moved but not forgotten. The cleric studied the space longer than the rest of us, his expression unreadable, and I wondered, not for the first time, what his god made of places like this. Not places of suffering exactly, but places of coordination, where cruelty was not enacted directly so much as distributed across distance and time until no single hand could be said to own it. We moved carefully, listening, allowing the space to speak in the way such places always do, not through confession but through habit. Voices came and went, always distant, never close enough to distinguish, and I began to notice a pattern in them, not words but rhythm, the cadence of instructions given and received, the pause that followed compliance, the steady background murmur of an operation that did not require raised voices to function because nothing here was being contested. It reminded me, uncomfortably, of trade halls and counting houses I had known in other cities, places where efficiency was mistaken for virtue simply because it produced results. Efficiency sounds the same everywhere. We found the first ledger by accident, tucked into a niche behind a loose stone, not hidden so much as misplaced, the kind of oversight that only occurs when something has become so routine that it no longer feels vulnerable. It was bound in plain leather, unmarked, its pages filled with neat, unremarkable script listing quantities, dates, routes, and destinations with the kind of clarity that suggests the writer expected it to be understood by someone else, perhaps many someone else's, none of whom required explanation. Names were absent. That, too, was intentional. Instead, there were symbols, simple marks repeated often enough that their meaning became clear through proximity and context. Tallies matched to corridors, corridors matched to exits, exits matched to routes that extended far beyond Highport, sketched in shorthand that assumed familiarity with the wider world. This was not a local crime. This was a network. The fighter read none of it, though he stood close enough to see the pages, and I could feel the restraint in him again. Tighter now, harder to maintain, the kind that builds when the enemy becomes abstract enough to evade the simple comfort of confrontation. The ranger memorized what he could, eyes moving quickly, already mapping paths we had not yet walked, the way one does when retreat is no longer sufficient, but advance requires precision. The mage closed the ledger carefully when he finished, as though leaving it open might somehow allow it to continue doing its work, its presence alone enough to keep the system in motion. We replaced it where we found it. Not out of mercy and not out of fear, but because understanding had already been taken, and carrying the object itself would have changed nothing about the truth it contained. The slave lords were not here. That too became clear, not through absence of guards or signs of wealth, but through the nature of the space itself, which bore no mark of decision-making, only execution. Their presence lingered instead in the shape of the tunnels, in the consistency of the operation, in the way decisions had been made far from the places where their consequences were felt, orders traveling down, goods traveling up, people traveling sideways, vanishing into routes that led elsewhere. Highport was a node, important but replaceable. That realization settled over me with a weight different from what I had felt in the pits or the warrens, heavier not because it was crueler, but because it was harder to end. You can break chains, you can collapse tunnels, you can disrupt routines, but networks adapt, they reroute, they continue. We withdrew again, this time not because we had seen enough, but because we had seen too much to act without thought, the system having revealed its shape just enough to make impulse feel irresponsible. With knowledge came responsibility, not the kind imposed by lords or contracts, but the kind that settles in once you understand how far the reach extends and how many lives depend on its continued operation, whether they benefit from it or suffer beneath it. As we moved back toward the narrower passages, retracing steps we had taken with less awareness, I felt the last of my earlier uncertainty fall away, replaced not by certainty but by commitment. This was no longer about stopping raids along a coast or punishing those who profited too openly. This was about severing a connection that ran deeper than a single city and wider than any one group of slavers, a task that would require patience rather than outrage and planning rather than spectacle. The slave lords did not need to be present to be powerful. Their reach was enough. And now that we had seen it, there would be no clean way forward, no moment of triumph that resolved everything at once, only deliberate choices made with incomplete information and consequences that would not remain contained. We continued on in silence, carrying with us the shape of the system we had uncovered, and I understood that whatever came next would not be decided by impulse or anger, but by where the network could be broken and how much we were willing to lose in the attempt. Some structures collapse when struck. Others must be dismantled, piece by piece, with full knowledge of what they will take with them when they fall. And we were only just beginning to understand which kind this was.